The courtroom was tense as the officers confidently gave their testimony, the room hanging on their every word. But how had this simple traffic stop led to a full-blown courtroom battle? How had Xavier, a man of power and respect, ended up here? The questions lingered in the air, unanswered as the truth of what had really happened that night in Baton Rouge slowly began to unfold. The evening in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, was thick with the humid air of late summer, the kind that pressed down on everything it touched. The streets were quieter than usual, bathed in the soft yellow glow of streetlights, with only the occasional passing car disturbing the silence. Xavier Winslow, the chief of the FBI's Louisiana division, was nearing the end of a long, exhausting day. As the clock ticked past 11 p.m., dressed in his sharp suit and tie, he prepared to head home, his phone buzzing with routine updates on ongoing cases. Yet his mind was elsewhere. He longed for a peaceful evening without the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. As he drove through the dimly lit streets of Baton Rouge, a sudden sound cut through his thoughts, a siren. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he saw the flashing blue and red lights, and a sigh escaped his lips. The last thing he needed right now was a traffic stop. He pulled over to the curb, expecting to be on his way in no time. Little did he know, tonight would change everything. The officer who approached his car was a middle-aged white male, his face stern and unyielding. Behind him stood a second officer, arms crossed, watching the scene carefully. "Evening, sir," the first officer said, his voice tight. "I need you to step out of the vehicle." Xavier's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "Is there a reason I'm being pulled over?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "Step out of the car now," the officer insisted, not explaining further. Xavier hesitated. This didn't feel right. There was no apparent reason for the stop, no speeding, no broken taillight. Instincts honed by years in law enforcement kicked in. "I need you to explain why I'm being detained," he demanded. The officer remained silent, moving to open the door, ordering Xavier to exit. As Xavier stepped out, he felt the tension in the air thicken. This wasn't a routine stop, it felt like a setup. As the second officer moved toward him, Xavier's mind raced. Could this be a case of racial profiling? Was there more going on here than a simple traffic violation? Ignoring his questions, the officers escalated the situation, forcing him to the ground and cuffing him. Resisting arrest was the vague accusation thrown at him, a label that was quickly applied as if it were a badge of shame. Xavier protested, frustration boiling within him. He was a high-ranking federal officer, a chief in the FBI. This shouldn't be happening to him. Yet, as the officers read his Miranda rights, he felt the walls closing in. One officer claimed he had interfered with an investigation, a baseless assertion made to justify their aggression. "You can't do this." Xavier's voice rose in defiance, but it was too late. He was being dragged toward the squad car, helpless against a tide of misconduct. He knew better than to escalate things further. The law might be on his side, but tonight it felt irrelevant. The next day, the tension carried over into the courtroom, where Xavier, still reeling from the arrest, faced a judge and a corrupt system that now bore its fangs through the very officers who had falsely accused him. Confidently, they painted Xavier as the aggressor, their rehearsed testimonies painting a narrative of justification. As the trial unfolded, it was evident the deck was stacked against him. The judge, a middle-aged white man, seemed all too eager to believe the officers, barely listening to Xavier's defense. It was clear his authority was intended to protect the officers at all costs. But Xavier was not just any citizen. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. A pivotal moment arose when, just as the judge was about to rule in favor of the officers, Xavier stood. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady and commanding. "I've waited patiently for this moment, but now I will speak the truth." The courtroom fell silent as he continued. "I am Xavier Winslow, chief of the FBI's Louisiana division." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching the judge's face drain of color. "And you, Judge, just allowed 2 officers to lie under oath. This is not just a case of misconduct. It's a betrayal of the very law you are sworn to uphold." Shock rippled through the room. The officers' faces turned to masks of uncertainty. They had no idea they were dealing with one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officers in the state. The truth, now unveiled, began to spread like wildfire. As news outlets caught wind of the revelation, the courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically. Xavier's words had shattered the narrative they had so carefully constructed. The media's attention shifted to Baton Rouge, the story going viral as social media erupted in outrage. Calls for accountability flooded in, and protests sparked across the city. Xavier's actions had transformed a local legal battle into a national issue. The judge, now under intense scrutiny, found himself lost in his own web of complicity as the nature of his decisions came into question. Though Xavier had won this battle, he understood that the fight for justice was far from over. The investigation into the officer's conduct began, though many viewed it as a formality, a mere response to public outrage. Meanwhile, the entrenched power structures of Baton Rouge seemed impervious to change. But with the tide beginning to turn, Xavier felt the spark of a movement igniting around him, raising a clarion call for reform and accountability. As the courtroom session adjourned, Xavier stood outside, the weight of the responsibility ahead pressing down on him once again. He had triumphed in court, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The real fight lay in rallying the community and ensuring that the public's voice wouldn't fade into the background of a flawed system. With renewed determination, Xavier Winslow was ready for whatever came next. The spotlight had shifted, and this was a battle he intended to win, not just for himself, but for justice itself. As the crowd outside the courthouse slowly began to disperse, the weight of their energy lingered in the air like the scent of a summer storm. Xavier Winslow stood tall, the bright flashes of cameras reflecting the urgency of a public eager for change. He had won the courtroom battle, but he could feel the resistance tightening its grip around Baton Rouge, a city that had long been entangled in silence and complicity. Determined to seize the moment, Xavier took a deep breath and stepped towards a small group of reporters. Each microphone thrust forward felt like a beacon, amplifying both his voice and the undeniable truths he had uncovered. "This is just the start," he declared, his voice cutting through the lingering murmur of the crowd. "What happened to me in that traffic stop is indicative of a much larger issue, the systemic abuse of power and the need for accountability across all levels of law enforcement." The reporters leaned in, their questions coming fast and furious, but one in particular struck a chord with him. "Chief Winslow, do you believe this incident is part of a larger pattern within the FBI and the police in Louisiana?" Xavier met her gaze and felt the weight of her inquiry. "Absolutely. This isn't just about two rogue officers. It's about a culture that allows misconduct to thrive. It's about how we hold our systems accountable. And it's about time we start listening to the voices crying out for justice." The sound of cheers erupted from the crowd, invigorating him. People were finally awake to the issues they had long tried to ignore. Yet, amidst the elation, unease crept into his mind. He was aware that making a statement was one thing, changing the deeply rooted culture was a monumental task. Still, for the first time in years, there was hope flickering in the hearts of those who had been silenced. As he made his way through the throng of supporters who now rallied around him, Xavier felt a sense of purpose. He reviewed the next steps in his mind, knowing that he had to lead the charge for reform. He envisioned town halls where community members could voice their grievances without fear, educational forums to discuss civil rights, and training programs that would promote understanding and respect among law enforcement. Change couldn't just come from the top, it had to grow from the grassroots level. "Chief," a young woman called out, her urgency cutting through the noise. "What can we do to help?" Xavier turned to her, appreciating her spirit. Her eyes were wide with anticipation, a reflection of the collective desire for change that had been bottled up for years. "We need to unite our voices," he responded. "Engage with your neighborhoods, start dialogues, attend city council meetings, and don't settle for lip service. Demand accountability from your leaders. Together, we have the power to reshape this city." As he walked away from the courthouse, a sense of resolve welled up inside Xavier. News of the case was already spreading, igniting conversations in homes and bars across Baton Rouge. The ripple effect had begun, and as social media buzzed with hashtags calling for justice and accountability, he knew the time was ripe for action. But Xavier was not naive. He understood that his victory was a double-edged sword. As the momentous wave of support surged, there would also be backlash from those whose power and privilege had never been challenged. Internal investigations. Yes, but it would be the hidden alliances and forces working behind the scenes that truly worried him. After all, there were powerful figures in Baton Rouge who benefited from the status quo, those who would do anything to protect their interests. Later that evening, as he settled into his modest office overlooking the city, Xavier started drafting a proposal to reform the police force. He jotted down his ideas for community policing initiatives, increased oversight, and transparency measures. Each word felt like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters, a way to build trust between law enforcement and the citizens they served. The phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Michael, his trusted ally within the FBI. "We need to talk. Urgent. Meet me at Gus's Diner in 30, it read. The urgency in Michael's text set off alarm bells in Xavier's mind. He quickly grabbed his keys and headed out, every instinct alert. As he drove through the dimly lit streets, the adrenaline coursed through his veins. What new challenge awaited him? Was it more about the case, or had the ripples of his exposure rattled cages he was unaware of? When he arrived at the diner, he spotted Michael at a booth in the corner, leaning in, his eyes darting through the front windows. "Xavier," Michael began, urgency lacing his voice as he slid into the booth across from him. "I've just received some intel that suggests the officers involved might have connections to something much larger, a network that reaches deep into the pockets of local corruption. They are not just going to let this go." Xavier's heart sank, but he quickly steadied himself. "What do you mean? Are we talking about organized crime?" "Yes, but it's also political. It seems there are players who would stand to lose a lot if accountability becomes the norm," Michael replied. "They are not going to let the exposure of this case reduce their grip without a fight." "You know what that means," Xavier said, a sense of foreboding gripping him. "They'll come after us." A flicker of determination ignited within him. "But we can't back down now. We need to be ahead of this, control the narrative, gather evidence, and go public. We'll make sure they know they can't silence us." Michael nodded, steel in his gaze. "I'll start digging into connections and potential backers. But we need discretion. The last thing we want is to tip them off." As the two men plotted, the stakes grew higher, and Xavier realized that the fight for accountability was about to become infinitely more dangerous. But for every threat they faced, there would also be allies rising to stand by them. The battle was set to deepen, and though the road ahead promised peril, it pulsed with the hope of something transformative. Xavier was ready, not just for the fight for his own voice, but for the voices of every citizen who had been silenced for too long. It was time to shed light on the shadows that had clung to Baton Rouge for far too long. As Xavier and Michael strategized, urgency filled the air of the diner, a seemingly innocuous establishment now the backdrop for a brewing storm. In the shadows of flickering neon lights, they began to weave a plan that could dismantle deep-seated corruption, but the risks were palpable. The world outside carried on, ignorant of the turbulence that lingered just beneath the surface. "Let's start gathering evidence discreetly," Xavier urged, his mind racing. "We need to connect the dots between the officers and this network before it grows even stronger. If we can identify the key players, we can expose the entire web of corruption that's been shackling this city." Michael nodded, his expression dissipating the earlier tension. "I have some contacts who can help us gather intel, but we need to be cautious. Any misstep could put us on their radar, if they suspect we're onto them." "A deadly game," Xavier interjected. He was acutely aware that the stakes had escalated from courtroom drama to a potential fight for their lives. "But we can't let fear dictate our actions. This is about justice and accountability." The pair devised a list of next steps, discreetly interviewing potential whistleblowers, tracking financial records, and leveraging Michael's connections within the local community. Xavier felt a renewed purpose course through him. With each task they outlined, they were not just taking action. They were building a coalition of courage, ready to stand against the tide of corruption that had long thrashed unchallenged. When they finally stepped out of the diner, the humid Baton Rouge air enveloped them, and the city felt alive with a new tension. A sense of urgency pulsed through their veins, forcing them to move quickly while the momentum of public outrage still thrummed around Xavier's case. People were waking up, demanding change, grasping for something tangible to hold on to, and he planned to give it to them. As they moved towards their cars, a figure loomed in the distance by the parking lot. A tall man dressed in dark clothing was pacing, his face obscured by the shadows of the streetlight. Xavier's instincts flared up. "Michael, wait," he whispered, scanning the figure closely. The man shifted, revealing a deep scowl. Xavier's heart sank when he recognized him, Officer Roberts, one of the very officers implicated in his wrongful arrest. "What does he want?" Michael hissed, moving slightly in front of Xavier as if to shield him. "Let's hear him out," Xavier decided, stepping forward cautiously. "Roberts," he called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. Roberts paused mid-stride, glancing around as if weighing the consequences of approaching them. He hesitated but then strode toward them, his features hardened with resolve. "Winslow," he said, his voice low. "I need to talk." "Do you? Because you'll forgive me if I don't trust you," Xavier replied, crossing his arms. He felt Michael's eyes boring into him, urging caution. "Just listen for a second." Roberts's tone was softer now, almost fragile. "There's more at play here than you understand. You think you're fighting just me and Thompson, but you're stirring a hornet's nest." "Then explain," Xavier pressed, his patience wearing thin. Roberts glanced around again, his brow furrowing as if the walls had ears. "There's a crew behind us, politicians, business interests, all tied in. They don't want the spotlight on their operations, and you're making them nervous. People have already started to go missing. You have to be careful." Xavier exchanged glances with Michael, who caught his eye with a mix of skepticism and intrigue. "You expect me to believe that, Roberts?" Michael asked, suspicion tainting his voice. "You've already lied under oath." "Maybe. But there are forces you don't comprehend," Roberts replied, his resolve shifting to an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm warning you. They'll go after anyone connected to this case. Protecting their interests is all they care about." Rage simmered beneath the surface of Xavier's calm demeanor. "So, what do you want in exchange for this warning?" "Immunity." "No," Roberts hastened. "I'm offering intel, what I know about the connections that run deeper than you realize. I need you to let me walk away." Xavier's mind raced, weighing the costs and benefits of this unlikely alliance. The battle he fought could gain a new critical vantage point, but trusting an officer like Roberts wasn't a risk he took lightly. "You expect me to believe you'll help after everything you've done." "I'm trying to make this right," Roberts said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I have a family. I know I messed up, but I want out. This system is toxic, and I can't be part of it anymore." "Doesn't feel like a great offer coming from someone who orchestrated your own downfall," Xavier replied, keeping his guard up. "If you want redemption, you'll have to prove it. Start talking." Roberts hesitated, glancing around the dimly lit parking lot again, as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. "Meet me tomorrow at the old mill, midday. I'll give you what I have. But you need to know it's dangerous. You divert someone's attention away from their interests, and it won't just be your life in danger. They don't distinguish between enemies and allies when the stakes are this high." With that, he turned abruptly and walked away, fading back into the veil of night. The weight of his proposition hung heavily in the air, and Xavier felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Are you seriously considering it?" Michael asked, incredulous. He could be leading us into a trap. "I don't trust him, but he might give us the break we need," Xavier said, determination surging again. "If there's even a chance he's right, we can't turn our backs on that intel." "But what if it's a setup?" Michael countered. "We could be walking into a disaster." "Then we'll be prepared by having backup," Xavier replied, conviction sharpening his focus. "We have to take risks to uproot this corruption. The people need us to see this through." As they drove home, Xavier couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. Doubt mingled with resolve, firing his determination to see it through. Roberts's warning echoed in his mind, but he pushed it aside, determined to forge ahead. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, but also new possibilities. If this was the path toward dismantling the corruption, he would walk it, no matter the cost. The fight for justice was now entwined with a battle against shadows, and he wouldn't step back until the truth was illuminated. As dawn broke over Baton Rouge, the first rays of sunlight spilled across the city, illuminating the streets with a golden glow that held the promise of renewal. But for Xavier, the morning felt heavy with the weight of uncertainty. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at his untouched coffee. Michael's words echoed in his mind. What if it's a setup? The reality of their situation was settling in, clutching at his heart with a mix of trepidation and resolve. He had spent the rest of the night thinking about Robert's warning. The implications of a network so deeply entrenched within local law enforcement and politics were staggering. Yet, with great risks came even greater rewards. If they could uncover the truth behind the corruption, perhaps it could finally provoke a change Baton Rouge so desperately needed. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. A text from Michael graced the screen. "Ready to meet? Let's make sure we're covered." Xavier texted back a quick affirmative, his heart racing as he drafted a plan in his mind. They needed to consider every angle, to ensure they weren't walking into an ambush. With a sense of urgency fueling him, he finished his coffee and slipped on his jacket. The old mill was situated on the outskirts of town, a relic of the past that had long remained abandoned, a perfect spot for clandestine meetings. As Xavier drove through the quiet roads, the images of the mill loomed closer with each turn. Was it merely a coincidence, or had Roberts chosen this location strategically? He couldn't afford to let curiosity become complacency. When he arrived, a sense of foreboding settled in as he parked the car. The mill looked decrepit, its once purposeful structure now consumed by nature's relentless grip. He stepped outside, scanning the area with caution. The air was thick, the only sound being the rustling leaves. Moments later, he spotted Michael approaching, clad in dark clothing as if to blend into the shadows. "You ready?" he questioned, scanning the surroundings with a watchful eye. "Let's see what Roberts has to say," Xavier replied, a mixture of determination and uncertainty pulsing through him. Together, they approached the entrance of the mill, the creaking floorboards beneath their feet echoing ominously as they ventured inside. Inside, they found themselves enveloped in a dim haze, the light filtering through broken windows creating patterns of shadow on the wooden floor. The atmosphere buzzed with tension. They were not alone. "Over here." A voice called softly from the back. Xavier's senses heightened as he and Michael moved cautiously through the interior, their footsteps muffled by the dust accumulating on the ground. Roberts emerged from the shadows, his figure appearing smaller amidst the looming ruins of the mill. "You came," he said, attempting to mask the urgency in his voice. "I'm here for the intel," Xavier stated plainly, his demeanor unyielding. "What do you have for us?" "First, I need you to understand something," Roberts said, glancing around nervously. "You're not the only one probing into this. There are others, private interests, who will plunge anything into chaos to maintain power. Your case has sparked interest beyond your community. If you're trying to play both sides, this isn't going to go well for you," Michael warned, his demeanor fierce. "We need to know if we can trust you." Roberts looked fearful, yet resolute. "Trust is irrelevant. Survival is what matters now. But if you want to blow this open, you need to start here." He gestured toward a stack of dusty boxes in the corner. "These documents contain evidence, correspondence, transactions, details, the link between youth abuse of authority and this corruption." Xavier moved toward the boxes, feeling the momentous weight of the truth they might unveil. "And what's your end? Why help us? I can't live with what I've been a part of anymore. This stops here. I'll provide you the contacts I have, but you must be cautious about how you handle this information. They are watching," Roberts warned, voice tense. As he rifled through the boxes, a chilling realization struck Xavier, a name printed on a ledger, paired with an affiliation far worse than he anticipated. It was the same name tied to powerful business entities, old money that had been pulling strings in Baton Rouge for decades. Suddenly, a series of loud footsteps echoed towards the entrance. Xavier's heart rate quickened. "We need to go. Now," he urged, shoving the documents into a bag in haste. Without another word, they bolted toward the exit, adrenaline surging as they darted through the mill. Just as they reached the door, a group of men with badges stormed in, their faces set with authority and intent. "Freeze. Hands where we can see them," barked one officer, his gaze fixed on Xavier and Michael with aggressive scrutiny. Xavier felt every fiber in his being tell him to run, but he was pinned in place, caught between the desire to flee and the reality of being cornered. Roberts, now pale with fear, stood rooted beside him. "You're both in a world of trouble now," he murmured, the betrayal evident in his expression. With no time to process, a decision crystallized in Xavier's mind. "We're not going down without a fight," he said, determined to reclaim the narrative. This was no longer just about accountability, it was about survival. He turned to Michael, their eyes locking for a fleeting moment of understanding. "On 3, Xavier whispered, adrenaline pumping. They would make their move, and they would not back down. As the tension in the air thickened, time felt as if it was stretching infinitely. In that crucial moment, they would need to decide whether to rise against the tide of darkness or become ensnared within it. The next few seconds would determine not just their fate, but the destiny of a city desperate to free itself from the chains of its past. It was a fork in the road, one that would lead them down a path lined with shadows, but also glimmering with the light of hope.